Hello, my name is Nabiha Noor, and I am going to be presenting Stigma in a Suitcase, looking through the Willard collection. There's little debate that there is a stigma surrounding mental illness. Usage of phrases such as OCD, bipolar, crazy in daily conversation to describe negative or atypical situations is commonplace. Horror movies and shows that feature asylums and their patients are fairly commonplace, and often those who are affected by mental illness become the villains. Even at Emma, this mentality slips in. Look at our haunted house this year. Haunted asylum. This is something that I've always found fascinating, especially as I realize that even though awareness of mental illness has increased, shout out to Nami at Emma Willard, there is still that stigma surrounding it. I went to Ms. Mossop and Mr. Callis trying to find a way to combine my love of history and my interest in psychiatry while making it into a project with tangible results. While in the early stages of planning, Ms. Mossop put me in contact with Ms. Cornelia Frisbee Hood, and I was able to access the state's collection of suitcases from the Willard Asylum. Every few weeks, Connie and I would go to the museum's warehouse, and I would get to look through suitcases owned by the state. I expected to learn about the psychiatric procedures that each patient underwent, but I found myself learning about their lives both before and during their commitment. When this happened, my focus shifted from procedures to people, and I began to think more about how the procedures and stigmas affected them, effectively taking on a completely new view. I wouldn't have it any other way. Built near Ithaca, Willard Asylum was originally intended to be an agricultural school, a plan derailed by the Civil War. Post-war, it was opened after a campaign to establish another asylum in New York State was spearheaded by Sylvester D. Willard, who the hospital was named after. Including separate wings for male and female patients, this asylum became almost entirely self-sufficient, with a hospital, its own train station, ways to generate business, and its own morgue. It eventually formed a close relationship with the adjacent town. Patients would go there on trips and to work and would often visit the doctors who lived in town. It was a step up from the previous county almshouses that each county in the state had, where mentally ill patients who were homeless or who did not have enough money to live in mainstream society were simply contained and given basic shelter, if anything. So then one of the diseases that was one of the most diagnosed diseases during the time that Willard was open, one that was dementia praecox, translating to premature dementia. Dementia praecox shares many symptoms with modern-day schizophrenia, the most famous being auditory and visual hallucinations, and expressions of emotions deemed inappropriate for settings. Of course, there were other symptoms of dementia praecox that were a bit more unconventional. Dr. Emil Kraepelin, the father of modern psychiatry, wrote in his textbook about dementia praecox that another symptom was a life of sin, and that those diagnosed were those who were, in his words, forsaken by God. Since dementia praecox was effectively a blanket illness that did little to differentiate cases from person to person, having treatment that was specific enough to help a patient move towards a life outside of the asylum was almost impossible. Instead of the current approach of attempted integration in society, patients typically were committed for life. Treatment was limited to targeting of specific symptoms, and it was often recommended that patients be given steady work to keep a set routine. It's little surprise that treatments deemed acceptable then would be seen as controversial now. As psychiatric procedures evolved due to new knowledge, the asylum employed the use of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, hydrotherapy, pharmacology, containment, and psychotherapy. ECT and hydrotherapy eventually came under fire since they were often deemed painful and ineffective, and containment was seen as damaging. As the stigma surrounding mental illness decreased, procedures became a little bit less invasive. So then this is one of the pictures of Willard Asylum in 2014. Most of the buildings are no longer in use as the asylum shut down. Here is another picture from inside the asylum, taken by Mr. John Crispin. He is the inspiration behind my project as I have done it now. After Willard closed, people who went into the asylum discovered hundreds of suitcases in the attic. They belonged to patients who checked in and then died there without having any next of kin claiming their belongings. Some were returned, and the rest were photographed by Mr. Crispin in a series of moving photos that served to catalog the contents of the suitcases and provide insight into the lives of most of the asylum occupants. Here's one suitcase picture that Mr. Crispin has taken, and it's a personal favorite of mine, belonging to a Margaret D. She brought effectively her entire house, including her car. Confidentiality laws require that the last name is obscured, which is why some tags look doctored. Regardless of content, these suitcases all share the common theme of revealing their owners' values and what they saw as necessary. Something I thought would be crucial when it came to understanding their lives within the asylum and how they were affected by incarceration. So then the suitcases were also added onto during the owner's commitments, so people could come in and bring stuff as they acquired it, which meant that the suitcases often contained clothes, books, trinkets, anything that patients found important to them. There were hundreds of suitcases in the collection, but I forced myself to focus on two personal ones, belonging to a nurse named Flora and an activist and domestic worker named Rodrigo. Both were diagnosed with the previously mentioned dementia praecox and treated with containment in hopes of creating a steady, stress-free environment, which meant that they had to create lives within the asylum, and they both did. So my first person is Flora. She lived a very rough life. Her mother left the family when she was 14, and she was forced to raise her siblings on her own. She became a nurse, but attempts to live her own life were always overcome by severe doubts and depression. She was admitted at the request of her employer, and upon admittance was diagnosed with dementia praecox. She was treated with confinement, work, and therapy. She put her nursing abilities to use by working in the ward, and she also became a seamstress within the hospital. She became a fixture. After looking over her case with a more modern eye, Flora would have been diagnosed with severe depression. She would not have been hospitalized unless she had attempted to harm or kill herself, and instead would have been told to seek psychotherapy and take medication. So then she was a very religious woman. A lot of the people within Willard brought religious texts with them, Bibles. She actually had certificates proving that she was an Episcopalian, and she took her certificates with her so that she could transfer from parish to parish without any issues. So then this is one of her hymnals. And then she also kept many letters. There was a card from her mother pre-abandonment. There were pictures of people I'm assuming are relatives or friends. And then this one card actually mentioned her brief illness that committed her to a state hospital. Obviously, there was still a certain stigma around saying it was a mental illness. If this had remained hidden, her illness and her incarceration, it was likely that she had underlying symptoms or conditions that would not have been discussed or addressed. And then this is Rodrigo. He was born in the Philippines and came to the US at age 9 to study. And then he went from state to state, and along the way, he had many grand plans. He planned to become a Methodist minister, but then he had carried on an affair with an American woman with intent of marrying her, something that was derailed by his getting syphilis. So then he eventually, even though he had very high expectations, big plans for himself, he became a domestic worker, which was something he wasn't exactly expecting. And then along the way, he began having auditory hallucinations, voices telling him of his failures. And then his employer actually requested that he be admitted. But something that I found interesting, her request for his admittance said the patient. It didn't say the person requesting. It didn't refer to him as a person who she thought may need to be admitted. It was just a given because she said so. And then, due to the auditory hallucinations, his current diagnosis would have been paranoid schizophrenia, and he would have been treated with psychotherapy and medication with hopes of integration and community support, even if he would have had to have a brief stay at Willard. He had a lot of diverse interests as well. Books, he had pages upon pages of poetry that he wrote himself, that he gathered from others. So then, this is some of his writing. He actually wrote many stories along with reading others. He attempted to write his own life in some of them too. There was one story of a Filipino medical student who was carrying on an affair with an American woman, except instead of the story ending the way his did with a breakup, the student in the story died in a boat crash. So he did bring elements of his own life into what he wrote, even if it wasn't exactly the same. He also had a moral code that he attempted to write down. I had 4 boxes of books that he had acquired. He had books in all kinds of languages, mainly, but primarily it was English and tag-along, which he was fluent in. And then here are some newspaper clippings of his. You could see a lot of his political interest by what he kept. He was a very firm believer in Philippine independence. And then in a book that he, along with in his personal effects, there was a flag, the Philippine flag, and a poem on the other side about his homeland. And then, so after looking through these suitcases and finding out as much as I did, I thought it would be cool to apply what I learned and create one of my own. So I'll now introduce Margaret. Similar to the others, she was diagnosed with dementia praecox after being referred to the state by her mother due to her depression. Was she alive today, she most likely would have been diagnosed with clinical depression and treated much like Flora would have. So I have given copies of a letter, and I would like you to just read it now.
Margaret, I have sent the money to you like you have asked. Mother says hello and asks that you respond to her postcard soon. You mentioned some improvement in your illness, and I hope that you can come back soon. Joseph says hello too, and also that he saw William with his wife. She is not as pretty as you, but he never was either. I don't see what you saw in him. I have found a job for you when you get better. It is in a small schoolhouse, and it should pay well. It is also close to home, so you could come visit the family. Father would have wanted you to get over this sickness. Recover soon, please. Love, your sister Teresa.
All right. So, from that letter, what is one thing that you would assume about Margaret?
That she has a family. She wasn't by herself.
Mm-hmm. Any details about her life that you think may be interesting?
Well, I guess I'm interested in the past tense of the father would have wanted you to get over this sickness, that it sounds like her father must have passed away. And I'm curious as to, was that when she was young? Is that?
All right. So, here is Margaret's story. Born in Massachusetts, she moved with her mother and her siblings to New York to be with family when she was 12, after the death of her father. You are correct. She was diagnosed with dementia praecox upon admission to Willard. She lived to be 78 and died within the institution. She came from an upper middle class family and she had 3 siblings. One wrote her regularly, Teresa, and others every once in a while. She kept some letters, but not all of them. And she was briefly engaged when she was 18, but that broke and she had no other relationships after that. All right, so what you did in a few moments, that took me an entire year. By looking through the suitcases, I was able to piece together lives that were affected by being admitted to Willard, especially when looking back. Some of those patients could have possibly led a life outside of the asylum if they were given proper care. It was intense, to say the least. Don't get me wrong, some of these people would have had many issues living outside of the asylum and probably would have been committed at some point, even with current psychiatric procedures, but since the stigma surrounding mental illness played a major role in the lack of research, there is very little way to tell who would have had a chance of not being confined. I've discovered something that seems really obvious now. I noticed that the more research was done, the less controversial the treatments were. They became less invasive and took up less of a person's life. Treating mental illness as any other illness made it, and makes it, easier to research since people are not afraid to come forward and ask for help. Something that even now still hinders the chances for new discoveries to be made. There's been a lot of improvement between the morally corrupt era and now, but in order for progress to keep happening, we as people need to lessen the stigma around mental illness. This entire presentation was centered on history, but I sincerely hope that it can help with providing context for what needs to be done in the future. All right, here are some people who helped me out along the way and who I'm extremely grateful to. So Connie, thank you for helping me out and bringing me to the suitcases in the first place. Thank you, John Crispin, for providing the pictures that became an inspiration for my project. Thank you, Mr. Callis and Ms. Massa. And thank you for coming.